Welcome to the oldest social and business club in India, the Bengal Club. Set up in 1827 as a meeting place where people from the military, the judiciary, businessmen, and professionals of the British Empire gathered together. Independence brought about a change in clientele, but not in character. Professionals, businessmen, people from the service sector, bureaucrats, and academics started rubbing shoulders in the corridors of this hallowed institution. Welcome to the library of the Bengal Club, an institution within an institution. A veritable collection of books, the like of which you're unlikely to find anywhere else in the city, and indeed in this country. Recordings by famous speakers who have spoken here in the library, and a collection of books on any subject that you may want to look for. Books by Nobel laureates, books by Bengal Club members, books on political science, philosophy, ethics and morality, food and drinks, sports and culture. Mention the subject and it's available here. There is also a small Wi-Fi corner where you can browse the internet in peace. They say there is no subject under the sun. If you're looking for a book, you will find it on these shelves of the Library of the Bengal. Envy the books, enjoy the collection, but above all, celebrate in the ambience of this wonderful library, the Library of the Bengal Club. Welcome to see the other famous individuals who have launched their books on this site. And recordings of that book launch are also available in this library. Welcome to the Library of the Bengal Club. On behalf of the Library Subcommittee, welcome to this program. This program of the Library Subcommittee, it is customary to introduce the guest of the day, and I will tell you that there was no television or mobile phones. Man had not yet set foot on the moon. Dr. Zhivago was still being filmed, and Sound of Music had not been released. Pakistan was still working out ways to enter into our western borders, and Bangladesh had not been created. That was the sort of time I first met the speaker for this evening, Mr. Sujoy Das. I won't say any more because I don't want to give either of our ages away. Sujoy started his life in St. Xavier's, very much like me, in pursuit of academic excellence, as we all thought we would do. And then very soon, in addition to that, decided that his love was tennis. And indeed, that was the first thing he excelled in. And unknown to a lot of you, Sujoy actually reached the finals of the national sub-junior tennis championship. And the man he lost to was a horrible tennis player who none of us liked. But I think it was a matter of nerves. Unfortunately, the system, read seniors,
forced him to give up his love for tennis and get involved in academics again, which he again took up seriously. This is no reference to anybody sitting in this room. Which he took up again and did a BCom and came out with chartered accountancy with flying colors. And in fact, not only that, became a chartered accountant and joined a partnership firm which he still runs. When I say he still runs it, it is run on his behalf by his partner. Because shortly after starting off as a chartered accountant, like his career in tennis and chartered accountancy, his next desire was to become a professional photographer. And this is again something he excelled in, and you're going to see lots of that for the next hour or so. And while he was madly in love with photographing the mountains and spent all his time in the high altitudes, leaving his chartered accountancy firm in the firm care of his partner and colleague, who I see is missing today, probably still looking after the firm.
He's in CCFC.
And
CCFC.
again, no reference to anybody here. But thereafter, he decided that he wanted to become a trekker in the mountains. So from tennis and chartered accountancy to photography, he became a trekker. And he trekked in high altitudes in places that most of us would be scared even to tread on. And a fantastic job he did, because there was his ability to trek in the mountains combined with his passion for photography. And then finally, he decided to set up a trekking company. And this was the culmination of all his loves in the world. Because here was somebody who used the stamina he had gained from tennis, the love of mountains that he had gained as a photographer, his genius in trekking untrodden paths which he had perfected as a trekker, as somebody who led people into treks in the mountains, and finally his chartered accountancy ability of managing the matters of a company, a trekking company, all got together as Sujoy now is the proud owner and runs a trekking company which allows you to go with him up to the mountains. Somewhere in between all this, he forgot one thing, he forgot to get married. And somewhere up between tennis, photography, and trekking, he realized it's never too late and decided that a beautiful young lady from Shantiniketan, far away from the mountains, was one he was going to spend the rest of his life with. So while we were all struggling with boring professions of brain surgery and things like that, Sujoy spent his time in outdoor pursuit of so many things rolled into one that I think I should not tell you any more about, because when he starts talking, you will see the culmination of all these things that he aspired to do and that he has absolutely achieved. So, ladies and gentlemen, I have great pleasure in presenting my classmate and friend for over 55 years, Mr. Sujoy Das.
Thank you, Shondip, for giving my detailed biodata, the details of which were also sort of cloudy to me, but they're quite sharp right now. So, good evening, friends. A very warm welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'll ask the lights to be dimmed a bit later, but let me just give a brief introduction to start with. So my presentation today is on Kanchenjunga, a mountain which is very close to my heart. I spent most of my childhood looking at Kanchenjunga from Darjeeling, and even today, after 40, 50 years, the Darjeeling view still remains extremely special. I think many of you sitting in this room today who have links with Darjeeling will also share my feelings and sentiments. So Kanchenjunga, 8,586 meters, is the third highest mountain in the world after Mount Everest and K2 in the Karakoram. But Kanchenjunga is more than just a mountain. It is more than a solid mass of rock and ice. I think, I may be wrong, but I think next to Mount Kailash in Tibet, Kanchenjunga is the mountain with the greatest religious significance. Kanchenjunga is the guardian deity of the people of Sikkim who worship the mountain. And every year, on the 15th day of the 7th month of the Tibetan lunar calendar, which corresponds to the month of September, there is a major festival which is held in Sikkim called Pang Lapsol, which honors the mountain Kanchenjunga. And this festival is held only in Sikkim. It is not held in any other part of the Himalaya. It is exclusive to Sikkim. And to prepare for this festival, the lamas, the monks of Pemyongsi Monastery in West Sikkim, undertake an arduous and long trek in the monsoon to a grazing alp above Zongri at about 13,500 feet high called Dablakhang. At this alp, which is a very cold and windy spot, there are 4 chotans which are erected to Kanchenjunga. And at this spot, with Kanchenjunga just behind, the lamas pray to the mountain. And after they complete their prayers, the Pemyongsi lamas, who were known as the royal lamas, come to the palace monastery in Gangtok and conduct a series of prayers in Tuglakhang. And after they finish their prayers there, the Pang Lapsol dances can start. So this is a brief background of Kanchenjunga and its religious significance for the people of Sikkim. So my presentation today is actually in 2 parts. The first part of the presentation deals with the history and exploration of Kanchenjunga, beginning around the 1850s and culminating with the first ascent of the mountain by the British in 1955. There are 2 other ascents which I cover briefly, 1977 by the Indians and 1979 by a British team, both of which were landmark ascents and by different routes. We'll come to those ascents through the presentation. The second part of the presentation deals with my own journeys around Kanchenjunga for the last 40 odd years through a series of photo essays and cover both the Nepal as well as the Sikkim side. So let us get into the presentation. Can we have the lights off, please, at the back? Thank you. There are some lights on the side. So this is actually a view of Kanchenjunga which many people do not see. This is a view from a spot about 4 hours short of the Zemu base camp called Green Lake, where you see the entire northeast face of the mountain and the northeast spur by which route this mountain was climbed in 1977. You also see here all the peaks of Kanchenjunga, south, central, main, Yalungkang, and Kangbachen. And the interesting thing about this photograph is that when you look at it, the valley here, which is actually where Green Lake is about 5,200 meters, and the summit of Kanchenjunga is 8,586. So you're looking at a wall about 10,000 feet high, which is quite spectacular. So this presentation uses a lot of historical maps and diagrams and news clips as well to build up the historical part of the mountain. So these are actually copyright of all the different owners like the Royal Geographical Society, the Alpine Club, and so on. And it's for non-commercial use. The mountain which you see here is actually one of Kanchenjunga's satellite peaks called Janu. This is a 7,700 meter mountain. And this is the north wall of Janu, which was referred to as the Wall of Shadows. And it's one of the most difficult walls to climb. So Kanchenjunga, actually the pronunciation of Kanchenjunga is Kanchenjunga, and that is the way the Lepchas and the Sikkimese pronounce it. But most laymen like us pronounce it as Kanchenjunga. So that is the normal pronunciation which we use. So Kanchenjunga loosely translates into the 5 treasures of the Great Snows. And what are these 5 treasures actually? So there are different interpretations for these 5 treasures. It could mean the 5 peaks, Main, Central, South, Yalungkang and Kangbachen. It could also mean the 5 glaciers surrounding Kanchenjunga, Zimu, Kanchenjunga, Yalung, Tolung and Jonsong. And finally, it could mean the 5 Buddhist treasures, salt, grain, holy books, gold and weapons. So this is a map which gives you a background of the glaciers around Kanchenjunga. I'll spend a little bit of time on this map. You have Kanchenjunga here, right in the middle. And this map, in fact, was drawn by a gentleman called Garwood. It's referred to as the Garwood map. And it's one of the first maps which mapped the glaciers around Kanchenjunga. Garwood was with the Freshfield expedition of 1899. So this map dates back to that time. And we'll take a look at the glaciers which I referred to. You have the Kanchenjunga Glacier here, which is in the northwest of the mountain. You have the Yalung Glacier here, which is in the southwest. You have the Tolung Glacier down here, which is in the southeast. And you have the Zimu Glacier here, which is in the northeast. And finally, to the north of Kanchenjunga, you have the Jonsong Glacier. And in fact, this line which is running here, this particular ridge which you can see, Nepal Gap, the Twins, Kanchenjunga, Tolung Peak, Kabru and so on. This particular ridge which runs here is in fact the extension of the Singalila range, and this is the boundary between Sikkim and Nepal. So this side of Kanchenjunga, all this area, this is actually, we are looking at Sikkim, and this side to the west, which we are looking at, is actually Nepal. So this is a more recent map. This is a Japanese map, which is actually far more detailed and has more information. So I'll just highlight a few points on the map which I have marked with red. Again, we have Kanchenjunga here, right in the middle, and this is the ridge running down. In fact, it's marked here now as the Singalila range here, all the way down. This is the high point of Gochila, where people trek nowadays, and you have Zongri, not marked here, somewhere here. And a little below that, somewhere here, you would have Pamyongsi, and further down, you would have Darjeeling. So that is just for your points of reference. And the 2 base camps of Kanchenjunga, the northeast and the northwest, are actually marked here. This is the Green Lake Base Camp, which is in North Sikkim, and this is the Pangpemak Base Camp, which is in Nepal. So actually, when you look at these 2 base camps, they're not very far from each other. They're actually pretty close. But the problem is that you have this huge mass of Kanchenjunga and the other peaks in front of them. So I'll be showing you photographs from both sides, from this side as well as from this side, of the same peaks, so you get an idea of the views on both sides of Kanchenjunga. And here you have a small village called Gunsa. Gunsa is the village which you have to reach if you want to go up to this Kanchenjunga base camp in Pangpema. It's a long and difficult trek, which takes you up all the way and brings you to the glacier base camp here. And the south base camp, the Nepal South Base Camp, is along the Yalung Glacier here. This was the route by which Kanchenjunga was first climbed in 1955. And it starts from Cheram and it goes up all the way. We'll take a look at the photographs and descriptions once we come to these specific regions. So the exploration, early exploration of Sikkim started actually around 1848, 1849. And the exploration was by a man called Joseph Dalton Hooker, who came all the way from the UK. Hooker was a botanist, and he was also a plant collector. But more than that, Hooker was an explorer. And the pioneering exploration which Hooker did in Sikkim between 1848 and 1850 is unparalleled, because no Westerner had been before him where Hooker went. And in a very difficult situation with most of the trails unknown and a team of porters with whom he could not communicate because he couldn't speak the language, he managed to trek and traverse every corner of Sikkim, including the far north. And the books which he wrote, the Himalayan Journal, Volume 1 and Volume 2, still remains as the major reference work on Sikkim, and we still consult Hooker's books today. So interestingly, Hooker was able to cross a high pass in North Sikkim called the Donkyala. The Donkyala is 5,400 meters up. If you've been to a place called Lachung in northeast Sikkim, and then you go further up to a place called Yumthang, where a lot of tourists go nowadays to see the rhododendrons. And you keep going further up. You come to a place called Yume Samdong, where there are some hot springs. And from Yume Samdong, there is a trail. I believe now there's a road, but when Hooker was there was a trail. And you cross that trail and you reach an 18,000-foot pass called Dongkyala, which gives you a view over the North Sikkim Plateau, as well as all the way to the Tibetan Plateau. So when I went to North Sikkim in 1987, a long time ago, I tried to reach the Dongkyala from this particular lake, Cholamu. But unfortunately that year, there was a lot of snow, and most of the approach to Dongkyala was blocked. So I could not reach there. But interestingly, to the east of Dongkyala, on the same axis, was a high point called Dorjila, around 18,600 feet, where the army had a bunker. So I managed to get to Dorjila, and I stayed in that army bunker for one night with the Jawans. And from that army bunker, I could look right into Tibet. It was the first time I was able to see right the Tibetan Plateau. And when I stood there, you could see the Dongkyala on your right, further up and with snow. And I thought of Hooker standing on the Dongkyala. And Hooker said something which struck me as being very true. What Hooker said was, when he stood on top of the Dongkyala, he said that here the colorings are of the fiery desert, but the climate is that of the poles. Hooker was referring to Tibet, because if you sort of look at Tibet, it's brown, red, and oranges, but it has these fierce winds and these sub-zero temperatures. Hooker's second huge contribution was, of course, the rhododendrons of the Sikkim Himalaya, for which he is actually famous. He took back to Kew Gardens in London 40 species of rhododendrons from Sikkim, and he planted them there. His father, William Hooker, was the head of the Kew Gardens then. So father and son put down all the Sikkim rhododendrons in Kew. And if you go there today, there's a separate area where all these rhododendrons are flowering, because the climate of Britain and the climate of Sikkim are fairly similar, cold, damp, and misty. And Hooker's second book, Rhododendrons of the Sikkim Himalaya, so obviously it's out of print now and it's very difficult to get, had illustrations by Walter Hood Fitch. And this is one of the illustrations which he had, called Rhododendron Dalhousie. Hooker named all these rhododendrons which he discovered amongst his friends and his peers. So you have things like Rhododendron Walichi, Rhododendron Campbelli, Rhododendron Dalhousie, and so on. We now come to another legend, Sharat Chandra Das. Sharat Chandra Das was all these things together. He was a scholar, he was a spy, he was an explorer, and he was an engineer. So Sharat Chandra Das was made the headmaster of the Bhutia boarding school in Darjeeling in 1874. This Bhutia boarding school was actually set up by the British to train geographers and cartographers. They wanted to build up a pool of indigenous geographers and cartographers who could be sent into Tibet and bring back information, map Tibet for their Tibetan masters. Sharat Chandra Das was an expert in that field, and he made 2 trips to Tibet, one in 1879 and again in 1881. And Ugen Gyatso, who was also another one of the Pandits, these Pandits were actually code-named, so Ugen Gyatso was UG and Sharat Chandra Das was Pandit SCD. So both of them together crossed a very high pass in west of Sikkim, right at the border, called Chotannimala. Chotannimala is almost 19,000 feet high, and it's very difficult to cross. I haven't crossed it. And both of them crossed Chotannimala, and they went to Tibet in 1879. So Sharat Chandra Das was actually obsessed with Tibet, and in fact, after he completed his Tibet missions, he stayed in Darjeeling for a long time, and his house was named Lhasa Villa, after his Tibetan expeditions. I think Lhasa Villa is still there, but I don't know what is the condition of Lhasa Villa right now. So Rinzin Namgyal was the third Pandit of note, and he was codenamed RN. He was also working for the British, and he explored the Tolung Valley. This was the first exploration of the Tolung Valley, 1883. But in 1884, Rinzing did an exploration which actually went unnoticed, and that was very sad because he actually did the circuit of Kanchenjunga 15 years before the Freshfield expedition. And with a small team, he was able to complete the whole circuit. And as a result of that circuit, he was able to define the location of the Jonsong La, the pass between Sikkim and Nepal. And he was also able to map the frontier for the British between northeast Nepal and northwest Sikkim. So this is the famous 1899 exploration, which is known as Round Kanchenjunga. Douglas Freshfield came from Britain. He was a lawyer, also a mountaineer and an author, and he managed to rope in a very famous Italian photographer called Vittorio Sella. So Freshfield and Sella started this long exploration in 1899, but they had Rinzing Namgyal on their team. Freshfield had ensured that he had somebody who knew the route. So in fact, it was mainly due to the guidance of Rinzing that this expedition was successful, and they managed to finish the route. The route which they followed, we can run through quickly. They started from Darjeeling, went up to Gantok, went further north to Lachen, swung west to the Zemu Valley, Green Lake, climbed up to the Lonak Valley. This is across a pass called Thula, comes to a spot called Muguthang. From the Muguthang, swung west, crossed the high 6,000-meter Jongsongla, which was a very difficult pass and put them into a lot of trouble. Came down the Kanchenjunga Glacier to Pangpema, which is the base camp on the northwest side, and then followed the valley all the way down to the town of Gunza, crossed another high pass called Chunjerma, came to the bottom of Sikkim, crossed Kangla, entered Sikkim, entered Zongri, went up to the Gochila, and returned to Darjeeling. This is actually a dream route, and we all dream of it, but I wonder now with the political problems of borders whether we'll ever have the opportunity to do this route, and I doubt whether it's been done after the Freshfield expedition. So this is an interesting letter which I discovered, which Freshfield had written to Sella, inviting him for the expedition. It's a typical letter, understated British humor. And as he says here, I've got a cold in the head and feel very rheumatic and wholly incompetent today. I've not been up to anything since Mount Purdon last year, but I should like to see those great peaks and go around Kanchenjunga. I've thought so for 20 years, and how it is getting, perhaps it has got too late. But even after writing this letter, Sella accepted his invitation, and they started out on this great exploration. So a bit on Vittorio Sella. Vittorio Sella was born in Italy in a place called Biella, and he was one of the greatest mountain photographers of his generation. And I think if you think of mountain photographers, Sella would be right up on top, along with greats like Ansel Adams and others. So Sella photographed mountains in 4 continents, but his great pictures were taken in the Himalaya, in Sikkim on this 1899 expedition, and in the Karakoram in 1904, where he accompanied the Duke of Abruzzi to K2. And there are some brilliant pictures also. Most of them are there on the net of the Karakoram and the Mashebrum and Gashebrum mountains. So the year Sella and Freshfield were in the Zemu Valley, there was a very big snowstorm. You can see the result of the snowstorm here. The entire area has got snowed under, but that did not dissuade Sella. Apparently, he used to have a huge tripod. He had 2 porters supporting his camera equipment with an 8x10 plate camera, and he had a huge tripod, and he himself says that when he put the tripod in the snow, it sunk almost 3-4 feet, the tripod itself. So most of these pictures are taken under very difficult conditions, and here you have one of the photographs showing Siniolchu here, one of the most beautiful peaks of the Himalaya, and Kanchenjunga, part of it in the cloud, but part of Kanchenjunga coming out on top. And this, of course, is one of Sella's classic images. I think many of you may be knowing it. It's a picture of Janu from the Chunjerma Pass at sunset. The problem is normally when we cross Chunjerma, we just cross it in the morning and we go down. We never actually stop there and stay there. But Sella, knowing that there was a photograph here, actually camped at the base of Chunjerma so that he could get this beautiful sunset view of Janu. This image of Janu is one of Sella's classic images. So here there are 2 panoramas which are taken from the Pangpema base camp. The panoramas are almost identical. The panorama on top is taken by Sella in 1899. And the panorama at the bottom is taken by a friend of mine called Colin Monteith of New Zealand, who's also a very accomplished mountain photographer. So the reason I show you these 2 panoramas next to each other is because the top panorama was taken in 1899, and Colin's panorama was taken sometime during the 1980s, almost 80 years plus. But the interesting thing about the 2 panoramas is, other than the peaks which are the same, is the snow cover on the glacier. If you look at Sella's picture on top, it's just snow, snow, snow everywhere. That's it, because it was like that year. And if you look at Colin's picture here, the snow is gone. The glacier has just become, like most glaciers in the Himalaya, scree and rubble. The ice cover is gone, and this is a direct impact of climate change and global warming, which we are seeing in front of us if we compare these 2 images. So 1905, the first attempt on Kanchenjunga was by a gentleman by the name of Aleister Crowley, who was one of the most notorious characters of British mountaineering. Crowley, other than being a mountaineer, was also a black magic magician. He used to practice black magic. And other than that, he was a poet, painter, and novelist. So he was interested in making the first attempt on Kanchenjunga. So in 1905, he put together a small team and decided to attempt Kanchenjunga by the Yalung Glacier route, which coincidentally was the route by which Kanchenjunga was first climbed in 1955. But unfortunately, Crowley was not a very good manager of people, and he ran into trouble both with the Sherpas as well as with the climbers. So finally, at about 6,500 meters one day at Camp 5, there was a mutiny against Crowley, and the climbers and the Sherpas asked him to step down as leader of the expedition. Crowley, as usual, being what he was, belligerent, refused, and the rest of the expedition decided to go down. But they made a fatal mistake. It was already evening by then. The snow was not as hard as it should have been, and I think they just decided to escape from Crowley. The expedition was hit by a huge avalanche, and sadly, one climber and 3 Sherpas perished in that avalanche. And when Crowley was asked about it, he said, I asked them not to go. Why did they go? And they died. So that was the end of the 1905 expedition. And that was the first major casualty on Kanchenjunga. So we now come to another legend who is mostly passed unknown. He is definitely one of the unsung heroes of the Himalaya, Alexander Kelas. And sadly, Kelas has been overshadowed always by the likes of Mallory, Norton, Shipton, and so on. So the Scottish chemist had in fact Kanchenjunga on his mind when he came in 1907 to Sikkim. And during the period between 1907 and 21, he conducted 8 Himalayan expeditions. 6 were in Sikkim, and the balance 2 were in the Garhwal. And unknown to many, Kelas and his small team, he had 2 or 3 Sherpa porters with him, that's all. There was no big infrastructure like the British, no thousands of porters, thousands of camps, nothing. With this small team, Kelas made the first ascent of 5 mountains, all in North Sikkim. Baohunri, Kanchenjunga, Chomiomo, Sentinel Peak, and Langpo Peak. These 3 peaks are on the North Sikkim Plateau. If you go to Gurudongmar, you will pass all these 3 peaks. And if you go to Green Lake, you will see these 2 peaks. So Baohunri, 7128 meters, actually stands above Cholamu Lake on the northeast of Sikkim, just west of the Donkyela. And in 1911, he climbed Baohunri, but it was not known to him or known to anybody else that his climb was the high altitude record until 1930. And that record, unfortunately, in 1907, had been wrongly attributed to Tom Longstaff for climbing Trishul. Trishul was 7120 meters, and Baohunri was 7218 meters. So in 1930, when the Germans climbed Jonsong Peak, 7432 meters, it was then discovered that Kelas held a high altitude record for so many years. But unfortunately, by 1930, Kelas had gone. In 1921, Kelas had been asked to join the first British reconnaissance expedition to Mount Everest. And just before the expedition, Kelas had been in Sikkim. He had been on an attempt on Mount Kabru, which was unsuccessful, and he was also not very well. Despite his failing health, he joined the expedition, and at a place called Kampasong, which is in this photograph here, you can see the grave of Kelas, which was erected by the British. And at the back, you see 2 mountains, which he climbed, Kanchenjunga and Chomiomo. Truly one of the pioneers of early Sikkim. So Tombazi was a Greek photographer, and Tombazi's expeditions would have actually gone unnoticed. It was not very significant if it had not been for the 2 claims which Tombazi made. Tombazi entered Sikkim from the south side, the Tolung and the Gochila, and he wanted to attempt a pass called the Zemu Gap between Simbu and Kanchenjunga. But his claim to fame was that he claimed that he saw a Yeti at the bottom of the Gochila. This is typical stories of the various Yeti sightings which we hear and see. There were no photographs, even though Tombazi was a photographer. And subsequently, he also claimed that he crossed the gap, the Zemu Gap here. But there were no photographs of that either, which is quite interesting because Tombazi took a lot of photographs of that entire region, and he also published a book of his photographs. So people who went after him said that it was unlikely he had climbed the Zemu Gap because it was technically very difficult, and he would have either crossed two calls, 5450 and 5422, around the gap. So we now come to the two German expeditions of 1921 and 1931. And these German expeditions were led by Paul Bauer. They attempted Kanchenjunga from the northeast spur, the same route from the Zemu Valley. This was their line of camps all the way. And in 1929, they reached up here on this ridge, and they retreated due to bad weather, 23,800 feet. And in 1931, they got here, 26,200 feet, and they retreated from here. But in between, in 1930, there was another expedition, which was the International Expedition, which was led by Gunther Darenfurt from the northwest face. This is not the same route which Bauer attempted. This is from Nepal, the Pangpema route. And Frank Smythe was invited to be one of the members. But again, the same problem, poor weather, snow conditions, and avalanches pushed the team back. And as you see from this dispatch of Frank Smythe, which he used to send to the Times, that there was a huge avalanche. And it's interesting, I'll just read out one paragraph from this dispatch, which is very interesting, where Smythe is looking at the avalanche, and he says, "It was the most terrible spectacle I have ever witnessed. The roar grew louder as the clouds of snow swept nearer, moving with incredible velocity, while here and there vicious tongues of ice shot out under the confused jumble of great ice blocks, rolling and sliding down. I had watched like one rooted to the spot in a nightmare, but now I suddenly realized that the avalanche might sweep the camp away." So the interesting thing about the early climbs on Kanchenjunga was that whenever you felt that you were in a position to summit the mountain, you were at 7,600, 7,800, almost 8,000 meters, Kanchenjunga used to unleash either a severe avalanche or a snowstorm or a major bad weather condition and push all the climbers back. And this happened time and time again. So this was the German expedition I was talking about. It lost an expedition member, Schaller, and a porter. And at 26,000 feet, there was a major avalanche here as well. And the sad thing about most of these big mountain climbs, as I think many of you will know, that when you climb a big mountain like Kanchenjunga or K2, there's always a risk that you won't come back, and you have to accept that risk when you go on that mountain. But Paul Bauer was not going to give up. He wanted to return to the Zemu. He tried for Kanchenjunga again, but he did not get permission for Kanchenjunga. He decided to come with a small group of friends, and they came in alpine style in 36, and they made the first ascent of Sinyulchu here. They made the first ascent of Sinyulchu, this mountain here, which is a much smaller peak, 6,888 meters, and they also climbed some other 6,000 meter peaks like Simbu North, Green Lake Peak, and Podon Peak. So the Zemu Gap was on the radar of many mountaineers actually. The Zemu Gap is a difficult mountaineering pass between the mountains of Kanchenjunga and Simbu. And this is a picture of the Zemu Gap from the south side. You can see the tangled approach to the Zemu Gap through the various icefall and snowfall. So Bill Tillman made 2 attempts on the gap. In 36, he tried to attempt the gap from the south side, which is the photograph you see here. Unfortunately, he was not successful. And then, typical as Tillman was, he decided to make an attempt down a route which he had not been, and I don't think anybody had been. He and his Sherpas came down the Tolung Valley, known as the Tolung Chu. And there was no route on that valley. They had to literally hack their way through the forest. And Tillman, in his book, later described it as the trackless vale of tears. In 1938, however, he was successful in crossing the gap. He crossed it from the north side. He came up from this side and he descended from the south side, and it was the first crossing of the gap. So now we come to the first ascent, 1955. In 1955, Kanchenjunga was the highest unclimbed mountain in the world. Everest and K2 had been climbed in 53 and 54, and the British decided to launch an attempt on Kanchenjunga, led by Charles Evans. Charles Evans was the deputy leader of the 1953 Everest expedition, and he also had with him a member of that expedition, George Band. So the route which they climbed by is actually here. It's basically the Yaluk Valley. They climbed through the icefall up to Camp 4, came onto the Great Ice Shelf, Camp 5, came onto the Sickle and got to the summit here. And there were 2 ascents, one after the other. One was by George Band and Joe Brown, 25th May 55, and then the next day Norman Hardy and Tony Streether also reached the summit. And as they had promised the Chogyal of Sikkim, the peak was untrodden. They stopped a few meters short of the peak. And this is a picture of Band and Brown after they completed their climb. They're down to base camp. And when I saw this picture, I thought it's quite interesting that they are wearing very light, wool pullovers at that altitude, the sort of thing which we would wear in Calcutta. So the second, actually between 1955 and 1977, there was no attempt on Kanchenjunga. The reason was that the Chogyal of Sikkim resolutely refused to give permission to any expedition to climb. He informed everybody that Kanchenjunga had been climbed by the British in 1955. It was Sikkim's holy mountain. He did not want to climb the mountain, did not want to allow anybody to climb. And Colonel Narendra Kumar, popularly known as Bull Kumar, had approached him in the 1960s to make an attempt by this unclimbed northeast route, which pushed back the Germans. But the Chogyal refused. However, in 1975, Sikkim became part of India, and the political equations all changed. And in 77, through the IMF and the Indian government, Bull Kumar was able to get permission for Kanchenjunga, and he had a very difficult time on the northeast spur. It was an army expedition, as you see all the army climbers. And finally, on 31st May, when they had almost decided to give up, Major Premchand and Nayak N.D. Sharpa, in a Herculean push, managed to get to the summit and come down. But Bull Kumar had remembered the Chogyal, and he too stopped 2 meters short of the summit. This is the third landmark expedition on Kanchenjunga, 1979, by a British team, the Northwest attempt. And this expedition is a landmark climb for a number of reasons. Firstly, it was an alpine expedition. There was no, again, a team of Sherpas, porters building up camps and, traveling from camp to camp. There was Scott, Boardman, Tasker, and another climber by the name of Bettenberg, who did not go to the summit. And they basically climbed the mountain from bottom to top on their own steam. That is one. The second major achievement was the entire climb was conducted without supplementary oxygen. A climb like Kanchenjunga, 8586 meters without supplementary oxygen in 1979, was a tremendous feat. So this is a self-timer picture, actually, taken by the climbers short of the summit. This is the summit of Kanchenjunga, and here you have Boardman, Tasker, and Scott sitting below the summit. And look at the view which the route which they took. So this is the Pangpema wall, the northwest face. So they went up this way. This is their Camp 3 on the North Col. This is Camp 4. They crossed the snow and ski terrace. And the first attempt they reached here, 4th May. The second attempt they reached here, 14th May. And finally they made a third attempt from this Camp 5 and got to the summit on 16th May. So now we come to some of the writers and artists who were also infatuated with Darjeeling and Kanchenjunga. John Claude White was the first political officer of Sikkim for 21 years, and he traveled extensively. He wrote a book called Sikkim and Bhutan. Major Lawrence Waddell traveled for 10 years, between 86 and 96. He was a British doctor who also wrote a book called Among the Himalayas with a large number of historical images. Walter Hood Fitch was an illustrator, an artist who used to work at Kew Gardens, and he illustrated most of the rhododendrons for Hooker's Rhododendrons of the Sikkim Himalaya. Howard Somerville is better known to us as a mountaineer who was with the British expeditions in 22 and 24 and got to 8,500 meters. But he also was an artist, and he did a number of oils of Kanchenjunga. Marianne North, another British artist, came to Darjeeling in 78 and did a whole number of Kanchenjunga oils and drawings, which are in the collection of Kew Gardens. Edward Lear, better known for his nonsense rhymes, Owl and the Pussycat and so on, did a huge oil of Kanchenjunga, which is now in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And I believe out of the series which he did, Lear's oils now sell for £500,000. Nicholas Roerich, I think, does not need much introduction. He was in India for a long time. He had a castle in Nagar, the Nagar Castle, where he has a museum. And he had also visited Darjeeling on a number of occasions. So this is Lear's famous oil, Kanchenjunga from Darjeeling, 1879. It's quite interesting because he covers these huge tree ferns, which used to be in Darjeeling at that time. You have a group of people here, possibly the Lepchas, then Sikkim in front and Kanchenjunga right behind. This is one of Somerville's oils of Kanchenjunga, a closer view. I can't make out the date, so it's difficult to understand when it was painted. And Marianne North, 1878, a typical Darjeeling view. You see Sikkim in front with the Monstera creeper going up this side and a whole host of orchids on the right side. And then you have the two women sitting on a chair and looking at this view. And Roerich did a large number of paintings of Kanchenjunga. Of course, this is one of the more interesting ones, where he has this Lama here on a horse looking back at a monastery and Kanchenjunga on top. And this is some of the illustrations of Walter Hood Fitch, which are in rhododendrons of the Sikkim Himalaya. And finally, closer to home, our own Satyajit Ray did a film called Kanchenjunga, shot in Darjeeling in 1962. And this sketch here on the left, I think many of you can't see it, so I'll just read it out for you, is where he was going to shoot the film. So he has different places marked as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you have things like the Windermere Hotel, the Children's Park, the Observatory Hill Road, the Mall, the shops, the horses, referring to the stables, and the Jalapahar Road here. And this is Ray and his cinematographer, Shubhrata Mitro, in the white coat, actually taking a reading here of the actress. But more interesting is this Nepali boy who's looking bemused through the grills at this shooting which is taking place in Darjeeling. So finally, to end the first part of my presentation, we come back to Darjeeling, and this is a classic image shot by Das Studio 50 years ago, possibly. Das Studio has one of the biggest collections of historical images of Kanchenjunga and Darjeeling. And I have not been to Darjeeling for 7, 8 years now, so I don't know what it's like right now, but I can recollect most of this. This is the Havaghar where we used to sit at Planters Club and look at Kevinters on the other side. This is Bata, where we used to buy shoes. Then you had a studio called Singh Studio, which was somewhere here. And this was the road which used to go up to the Mall. And you had the old ambassador cars. Of course, Darjeeling has changed, so I think we'll not see Darjeeling like this anymore. So I now come to the second part of the presentation, which is my journeys in and around the Kanchenjunga region. So this is actually in 4 parts. The southern part of Kanchenjunga, which is Singalila, Zongri, Darjeeling. The northeastern part, which is Green Lake and the Zemu Valley. The forests of the Zemu Valley, there's a short photo essay on the forest cover and the life of, and the plant life. And finally, Nepal, which is the Pangpema and the northwest base camp. So let us start. So I was speaking about the 4 Chautins of Dablakhang, where the Pemeyongsi Lamas come to pray. And this is that location. If you go to Zongri, you can actually climb up here. It's about 45 minutes from Zongri. And it has Kanchenjunga at the back, and it has Pandim at the right, on the right. So we'll just run through these maps to give you an idea of what is happening. This map, I think, is familiar to most people. This is the map of the Sandakphu Falud trek, which is now also jeepable. And you have the Singalila Ridge here, Sandakphu, Sabargram, Falut, and continuing further up. You have Tonglu down here, and this is the route which we normally take. Most of this is now jeepable, but people still trek to Sandakphu and Falut. This is another trek which has become very popular of late. It's called the Barsai Foktedara trek, which you can either start here from Uttare, which is in West Sikkim on the Nepal border, or you can start from the rhododendron sanctuary of Barsai and make the circuit and come down. And if you want a longer trip, you can actually travel from Sandakphu to Falut to the Singalila, come here to Foktedara, and then return by whichever side you want, though most people do this shorter 5-day loop. And finally, there's another trek which is also gaining popularity, which is known as the Round Kanchenjunga trek, which follows the Singalila Ridge north of Chiabanjan here and continues all the way up, right almost in front of Kanchenjunga. And then it cuts back to the Zongri Maidan here. Most people would go up and see Gochela and so on, and then return back to Yuksam. So this is also a loop trek, which is quite difficult, and it takes around 14-15 days to complete. But everybody cannot trek, and most people would like to see Kanchenjunga. So there are a number of spectacular locations where you don't need to trek, and you can see Kanchenjunga. And this is one of those locations in West Sikkim called the Rinchintpong Kaluk Ridge. So this picture is taken on a full moon night, late October, and I'll just point out this is the Kanchenjunga peaks, Kanchenjunga, Kabru, Ratong, Pandim, and so on. This is the lights of Gazing, Lower Gazing and Middle Gazing, which is the district headquarters of West Sikkim. And this is the Pemeyongsi Lodge, which is Mount Pandim. This is the Pemeyongsi Monastery. This is the ridge between Pemeyongsi and Peling. This is the Sangacholing Monastery here. And this is this huge statue of Padmasambhava, which has been built recently, which you can see from far away, and it's actually lit up. So in October 2020, after the first wave of COVID, I had not traveled for almost 7-8 months, and I was itching to get out of Calcutta. And I think Sikkim opened its borders with some restrictions, like RT, PCR tests, and so on. So my wife and I, Paula, you can see her sitting here, decided to do the Uttare Foktedara trek. And this is our camp at Kalijhar. This is our tent. And you can see the peaks here, Janu, Ratong, Kabru, Kanchenjunga, Simbu, and Pandim. And you're actually much closer than Darjeeling and Sandakphu. There are just a few ridges in front of you. So it was a very good walk. And the most interesting part of that walk was that we did not meet any other trekking group on that trip. For 5 days, we were there with our team. And I think it was primarily due to COVID, though this can be quite a busy trek. So in July '89, I decided to make an attempt to reach Sikkim in the, Zongri Maidan in the monsoon. So this was that monsoon trip which we went through from Yuksam to Bakim. And this is my friend Srijit here, who is walking. And Yeah, this is my friend Srijit who is walking. But the problem of this trip was, being July, there was a huge number of leeches. And it was not only these small black leeches which were on the ground. There were these big green leeches who used to fall off the trees. And you know, most of the time on this 4 or 5 hour walk, we spent battling these leeches. And luckily the leeches ended at Bakim, because they don't go higher than 9,000 feet. So we managed to escape those leeches and get up to the Zongri Maidan. This was on the second day when we climbed up from Choka to Zongri, and there was this shepherd going up to the Maidan with his ponies carrying supplies for the summer. And in the spring of 1997, I was back in the Zongri area in March, and there was this magnolia tree just below Choka which was in full bloom. So this tree is actually still there. I went in November 21 and saw it again. It was not flowering at that time, but the tree is still standing. And the tree is still standing, and this is Pandim here at the back. And if you're up on those meadows in summer, in April, May, June, then you'll be greeted by the rhododendrons in full bloom and in different colors. So in '86, I went up to the HMI base camp. The deputy director of HMI, Nimat Ashi, I had met him earlier, and he had invited me to visit him. So I stayed with him for a couple of nights. So the HMI base camp is north of Zongri one day, and it has this magnificent view of Kabru, which is right at the back of the base camp. And this is a photograph taken by a guide, my guide, Binod Gurung, on the Kanchenjunga round trek from a place called Jamle Pokhari. So interestingly, if you look, the view is changed. What has happened is that Kanchenjunga, the eastern ridge, has gone behind Kabru, which has come in front. Ratong is here, part of Janu is behind these ridges. So I'm not entirely sure whether this is actually a very good viewpoint or not, because when you're further south, you see much more of the mountain, and you see a much longer view. You've come very close, and that's why the view is congested like this. So we come now to the Zemu Valley and Green Lake. Actually, I've been twice to the Zemu Valley, 1987 and 2014. And both times, I've been amazed by the pristine nature of this valley. The reason why the Zemu Valley and Green Lake is actually untouched and pristine is because it has been under a very rigid permit system right from the beginning. The Chogyal's government were reluctant also to give permits, and the Indian bureaucracy has continued in the same vein. So hardly 20-30 people, trekkers, visit that valley every year. There are no villages inside. There are no habitation inside. And it has been left more or less untouched. And on both my visits to the Zemu, 87 and 2014, I kept thinking that, you know, most valleys in the Himalaya must have been like the Zemu Valley until man penetrated them. So this is a view from rest camp, which is 1 day short of Green Lake. And it's a long view. You have Kanchenjunga sitting at the back, at the end of the valley, and you have Sinual Chu here. So we can take a quick look at this map, which tells us how we go. So Gantok is down here. You drive up to Lachen, 6 hours. The road goes up to Zima, and that's where it ends. And from Zima, you swing due left, and you follow the valley, and you come up to Green Lake with all the peaks. And on the way back, if you get the permit, you can cross these two passes, Tanchungla, Thiola, come to Muguthang in the Lonak, again cross the Lonakla and come to Thangu, making a full circuit of this region, but it's a long and difficult route. And now I believe there's a road to Muguthang from Thangu, so that would defeat the purpose of this walk. So in 2014, the trail had been totally devastated by landslides. There was an upper trail, which was not near the river, which we could not take at all because there was no trail left. And finally, after reconnoitering that top trail, which proved impossible, we wasted 3-4 hours and came down to the bottom trail. And the bottom trail was hardly any better than the top trail. As you can see here, most of it was through these rocks and boulders, and most of my party were very upset with me for bringing them on this very difficult trail. There were sections like this which had to be climbed where the locals had thrown in pieces of logs. This is my guide, Binod Gurung, helping my climbers to actually come up. So ultimately, when this bridge came down, then they went and built a permanent bridge. So that's the story of the bridge. This is on the third day of the walk up. You come to a place called Yabuk, 4,000 meters, where you have an acclimatization stop. So unfortunately, on that trip, it was snowing every night. And we had a hard time, actually, to staying dry. But after the snow ended, the snows used to come out. You can see them with fresh snowfall. This is actually my tent and some other tents nearby. And you have the moon behind the clouds. So rest camp view of Siniolchu. Freshfield had described Siniolchu as the most beautiful snow mountain in the world, a superb triumph of mountain architecture. And we were lucky to get this view in the morning of Siniolchu from rest camp. This is some of my trekkers standing here, actually waiting for the morning sun, which has just come up. And just behind, there's this huge wall of Siniolchu, which rises behind you. So I'm standing here at rest camp, around 4,450 meters, 4 hours and 1 day short from Green Lakes. And it's 6:25 in the morning, and there's a tremendous panorama in front of us. You can see Siniolchu, the peak which is right in front of me. And as the ridge goes further to the right, you come to Little Siniolchu, and further to the right, the ridge carries on. And you see in front of you Kanchenjunga, right there, the northeast face. And then you've got the Twins and Nepal Peak, and further on another unnamed peak. It's a tremendous morning, very cold, but just brilliant. So that was the panorama of Green Lake. And because the Zimu Valley has been untouched for a long time, you find a lot of wildlife there. We saw Bharal more than once. And this was the only photograph I managed to get of them, which was above us, actually on top with a telephoto lens. But they didn't seem to be very sort of shy. In fact, some Bharal herds crossed the trail in front of us going down to the river to drink. And other than Bharal, there are also a lot of bird life. These are a flock of snow pigeons flying in formation. You also have the predatory birds like lammergeiers, golden eagles. On the riverbank, you have birds like redstarts and wagtails. So it's very rich as both birds and flowers are concerned. And you come to a point, actually, short of Green Lake, where you turn a bend and you come right on top of the Zemu Glacier here. This is one of my trekkers having reached that point. But like, as I said, like all glaciers in the Himalaya, by 2014, the ice had gone, and most of it had been reduced to rubble and scree. It's most unfortunate. The Khumbu Glacier and Everest also suffers from the same situation. So if you come to Green Lake in summer, in April, May, these meadows would possibly be full of flowers like primulas, but we were there in autumn, so I think the flowers had dried up, but the colors were still quite spectacular. This is Simbu, this is Kanchenjunga, and this is Nepal Peak here. So this is the actual Green Lake. This is a 1987 view of the actual Green Lake. You have Kanchenjunga reflected here in the waters. You have Simbu here. This was in the month of May. I was with a Assam Rifles expedition who were attempting to climb, and there was a lot of snow at that time, and that's why you can see most of the snow all around. So the gentleman who's standing here with the red jacket is actually Major General Gokrethi, and he was leading the Assam Rifles expedition to Kanchenjunga in 1987, and this was the route which he was looking at, the same route which Abul Kumar had climbed. And one day he asked me that, why don't you come up with me? I'm going to take a look at the climbers. So I said, okay, we can go. So he took me on a very rough and treacherous boulder-ridden route about 500 meters above Green Lake, which is right below us here, somewhere down here. And there was this place, and he said, we can sit here. So while he was looking at Kanchenjunga, I again shot the valley. And as you can see, the entire Zemu Glacier is actually choked with ice. Here's the Zemu Gap here, which you can see. This is Simbu, and this is the ridge of Kanchenjunga coming down. So this is a moonlight shot, 2014 at night. It was actually quite cloudy in the evening, but it cleared up towards the night, and I was inside my tent looking out, and when it cleared up, I came out. My camera was already on the tripod, and I managed to take a series of pictures. This is one of them. The moon is here, actually, behind the cloud. It's just coming up, and Simbu here, the gap here, and Kanchenjunga here. So this is my team having breakfast at Green Lake the next day. As you can see, it's a spectacular day, and most of my team are focused on their breakfast. They're not very interested in the enormous view which is actually behind them. It's also very cold, and you can see heavy down jackets in the morning, so it must have been 0 or below 0. So this picture I want to discuss a little bit. The picture on the left was actually shot by me in May 1987, which shows Kanchenjunga and the Green Lake. This is the lake, and this is Kanchenjunga. But when I went in November 2014, after promising all my trekkers a Green Lake, there was no more Green Lake. The entire lake had gone, and I decided, I was not sure where I had taken the 87 picture, but I had some vague idea. So I came close to that, and I took a similar picture there. In fact, this ridge is actually here. So I took a slightly wider picture, and the lake would have been here, but there was no lake. So I'm not an expert on global warming and climate change, but I was told by various people that in 27 years, the effect of both climate change and global warming had wiped out the Green Lake, and it was unlikely to come back. So this is one of the chilling truths, which is actually in front of us, and I think most of us have been reading about Joshimath in the newspapers, but I feel Joshimath is only the tip of the iceberg, and there are many Joshimaths waiting to happen. So this is a lone cloud getting the sun at Green Lake for sunrise. So I was mentioning earlier that the Zemu was one of the most fabulous valleys I had ever encountered in the Himalaya, and the forest cover, the plants, was something which I had never seen before. So these are a few slides from the forests of the Zemu Valley. So this, I'm not sure what it is. I tried to identify it, but I couldn't. So there were these very fine tendrils coming from this tree, with this red bark, which we passed on the way. This was identified by a botanist as algae trentifolia on a rock, red and brown. This was again another rock which had 3 or 4 different types of foliage on it. This is actually what is known as the Chelianthus farinosa. It's the silver fern, which is also in that same valley, and I think there's a bit of frost on the leaves of the silver fern. This is white cotton wool-like molds which are on the ground. In the early morning, they were there. Actually, most of this I've not seen anywhere else. I just saw them in the Zemu, and after that, I mean, wherever I've been, different forests, different landscapes, nothing like this has been visible anywhere. And this was also a rock which I photographed with these white tendrils actually coming out of the rock. And of course, the flowers were all there. You can't go to Sikkim and not see flowers. So on the left, you have the Meconopsis paniculata, popularly known as the yellow poppy. And on the right, you have the blue poppy, which is Meconopsis horridula, found both in Green Lakes as well as other parts of Sikkim. And of course, the rhododendrons. I've just tried to photograph and show you the uncommon rhododendrons. I mean, everybody sees arboreum and barbatum and so on, but these are 4 rhododendrons which usually flower quite high, around 4,000 meters. Here you have lepidotum with different type of flowers, setosum, which is purple, campyllocarpum, which is yellow, and finally cinnabarium, which starts out in this reddish color on top, but when the flower gets older, it changes into an orange colored bloom. So the best place for seeing these rhododendrons now, I think, would be Yumthang and the North Yumthang Valley, because it's very difficult to get into the Zemu Valley to see them. And on my way in 87, I crossed the Lonakla Pass, and just below the Lonakla, there was these outstanding meadow of primulas, huge, big primulas, and really spectacular to see. So the last part of my presentation, which comes to Nepal, the northwest face and Pangpema, Nepal. So this is one of the most fearsome faces of Kanchenjunga. It is not the benign view which we see from Darjeeling or Sandakphu. It has these huge ice shelves or ice terraces, 1, 2, 3, and down these ice terraces and ice shelves, huge avalanches cascade down and finish climbers who try to attempt them. You have the Kanchenjunga Glacier here at the bottom. This picture is actually not taken by me from Pangpema. It's taken by me at a high point, about 400 meters above Pangpema, where I climbed up to actually see the view from the top. And you have here Kanchenjunga, it's Yalungkang and Kangbachen, the 3 peaks which are on this ridge, and the spur by which the British climbed in 79 and all the way to the top. So let's take a quick look at the map. Actually, the Kanchenjunga Nepal trek is very far, it's very remote, and it takes a long time to do. You have to start out somewhere in the south, well further down here, from the plains at a place called Bhadrapur, which is 1 hour from Siliguri, and then drive up to a place called Ilam, which is not marked in this map, which takes 4 or 5 hours. Ilam has a number of tea gardens. From Ilam, you continue another 4 or 5 hours. You come to this place called Taplejung. There's an airport marked here called Suketar, but don't worry about that because the plane never lands in Suketar. So it's one of those Nepal airports which just remain. And from Taplejung, there is a dirt track, which is equipped for a jeepable 4-wheel drive, which you can use, which brings you somewhere here to Chirua. So this whole drive takes about 2 or 3 days to get anywhere from where you can walk. And from this place, Chirua, at about 1,300 meters, right down in the valley, it's hot, it's humid. You start this long hike all the way up here to the base camp up here. And this is the border again with Sikkim. You find all the Sikkim peaks also marked here. Kanchenjunga, Tolung, Kabru, Koktang, Kangla. This is Sikkim on this side and this is Nepal on the other side. So this is just to give you an idea of how many people go to Kanchenjunga. In 2019, I visited the Kanchenjunga Conservation Area Office at Gunsa, which keeps the records of the tourists going. And we found that up to the date I was there, 20th November, there were only 800 tourists, and it was unlikely that any more would come because winter had come. And compared to that, the same year, Everest had 57,289 trekkers, and Annapurna, this is all the Annapurna treks. Annapurna Circuit, Annapurna Sanctuary, Poon Hill, and all the other small treks of Annapurna. Annapurna had 1,81,746 trekkers. So for those of you who have been to Everest and Annapurna, you can imagine what trekking to Kanchenjunga is like. And on the other side, on the right side, I give you a menu which I prepared because none of the lodges had any menu. And they used to ask you, what do you want? Do you want dal bhat? I said, no. Do you want noodles? I said, no. So I said, what can you make? Then she said, you sit down and sort of write it down. So I sat down with her, the lodge owner, and I wrote it down. So this is the sort of food which you will get on the Kanchenjunga trek. You can say goodbye to the pizzas and lasagnas of Everest and confine yourself to the dal bhats, the chapatis, and the momos. So this is the first day of the walk. It's actually a very pleasant walk if you're willing to give it time and, saunter through the valley. This is basically lowland cultivation, and it goes through cultivated fields. This is one of the locals who's walking. As you can see, he's in shorts, so it's quite warm, even in November. And on the second day, you pass through large tracts of cardamom plantations. This Kanchenjunga region is very strong in cardamom, and these are all the cardamom fields, and our group is walking through. And after 4 or 5 days, you reach this place called Gunza, which is an acclimatization stop around 3,500 meters. These are the roofs of the houses of Gunza. But Gunza is one of the coldest places that I've ever been to. You forget about places like Gorakshep and all that. I mean, it's so cold in Gunza, you can't imagine. And it's only 3,500 meters. And the reason why it's cold in Gunza is because the entire valley is encircled by high mountains. It hardly gets the sun. The sun hits Gunza at about 9:30 or 10 o'clock. By the time you're already shivering. And it leaves Gunza by about 2 o'clock. By the time you've just managed to warm up. So if you stay in Gunza longer than 1 or 2 days, you'll have a very, very difficult time. But you need to stop here because it's an acclimatization stop. So there was a lot of damage after the 2015 earthquake in Kanchenjunga region also. And this is the trail between Gunza and going up to a place called Kangbachan. There's 2 of my trekking friends walking here, and this huge damage due to landslides and earthquakes, which are likely to continue now because there's nothing left to hold the soil together. It's all just going to come down all the way. So this is one of the nice lodges of the region, Kanchenjunga White House, run by a friend of mine called Nupu Sherpa. If you ever go there, you should stay here. He's built these very nice small cottages here. And behind it, there's this spectacular view. You have Janu here, 7,700 meters. This is a smaller peak called Sobithonge, and this is a peak called Khabur. These are 6,000 meter peaks, and you need to make a 2-day acclimatization stop here. So the second day, we went up to the Janu Glacier and the Janu Base Camp for acclimatization. And this is another very spectacular walk. It takes about 3.5 hours to get here. And spectacular views. This is the base camp of Janu, somewhere down here. This is the Janu Glacier. As you can see, like all glaciers, there's no more snow left here. And this is the peak of Janu. This is the northern side of Janu. The photo you saw of Sela was the other side at the back. And this north wall was a very difficult climb. It was climbed by a Japanese team with great difficulty in 1976. So on the way, you've passed many smaller peaks. These are what is known as the Sharpu peaks up here, 6,000 meter peaks. And they make good alpine style climbs without much porter or Sherpa support. And before Pangpema, the last camp is a place called Lonak, 4,740 meters, where you stay in these small lodges. And Lonak also has a very good view of Wedge Peak, which you see at the back here. This is in fact a close-up sunset view of Wedge Peak, which is just to the east of Kanchenjunga. And this is another peak of that region, Taple Shikhar, small peak, 6,447 meters just before Pangpema. So, the most interesting thing about this Kanchenjunga trek from Nepal side is that until you can come here, Pangpema, this is a slide from my friend himalayaninfo.org who's mapped the peak, so I haven't used my own photo. Until you come here, Pangpema, you cannot see Kanchenjunga. So you spend 14 days languishing in the lower valleys, walking every day and thinking, where is Kanchenjunga? And you never see Kanchenjunga. Kanchenjunga never appears. And on the last day, there was another friend of mine with me, Sujoy. The others had gone back. And I remember somewhere here, Sujoy told me, I don't think we'll ever see Kanchenjunga. He had come almost till here. And I told Sujoy that we have to go to Pangpema. Because if we don't go to Pangpema, you're not going to see Kanchenjunga, and your 14 days will be futile. Because he was very exhausted. It was a very rough route. There was a lot of landslides. It was already 7-8 hours we had walked, and there was no Kanchenjunga in front of us. There was all these other peaks. Kiratchuli, Nepal Peak, Coxcomb, Taple Shikhar, and so on, but no Kanchenjunga. So finally, Kanchenjunga did appear. November 19th, 2019, and I'm at the of Kanchenjunga, the North Base Camp, Pangpema, 5140 meters. It's a beautiful day, no cloud, no wind, and perfect for looking at these mountains. So I'll take you around this magnificent panorama. The peak in front of us is Nepal Peak. Next to that is the Nepal Gap. And next to that here, the 2 peaks you see are the twins. And finally, you come in front of this huge wall of Kanchenjunga, the northwest face of Kanchenjunga, extremely formidable,
first climbed by Boardman, Tasker and Scott in 1979. And below that you have the Kanchenjunga Glacier. And there's a bit of Kangbachen coming into view. And as you pan the camera further, I have the sun right into my lens. You can see Wedge Peak or Changhimal, another one of the great walls of the Kanchenjunga group. And this is the rest of the valley as we go around. And slowly you can see the hut at Pangpema, which is unfortunately closed, so we cannot stay here. And we need to go back to Lonak this evening. But it's been a great day's walk, and it's a privilege to be here in one of these great base camps of the Himalaya.
So this is the Pangpema view, which you can see. I marked the peaks for you. Coxcomb, Taple Shikhar, the twins, Kanchenjunga and Yalungkang. And in November already, it is actually frozen. The water has frozen here. But a good thing to do, when I came here, I sort of realized that a good thing to do would be to actually bring a small tent and a couple of support equipment, some stove and some food, and camp in Pangpema for 2-3 days. So you could explore the ridges and valleys, both to the north as well as to the south. There are some high viewpoints, Dromori and so on, which can be reached in 5-6 hours, which would give you a spectacular view over the entire valley, maybe on another trip. So I come to the end of my presentation, and when I end, I would like to revisit around Kanchenjunga by Freshfield again. So when Freshfield was coming to the end of his circuit, he came to Zongri, and then he wanted to go up to Gochila. And on the way between Zongri and Gochila, you have this meadow which is called Onglathang. This is that flat meadow. Gochila is somewhere up here. So Freshfield camped on that meadow, and he was lucky to see Kanchenjunga in moonlight. This is the view which he saw, but this is not in moonlight. And I'll just read out what he said. So Freshfield said, "Our moon was almost full. The nearest snows were but faint and indistinct, while between their pale, shadowy masses, the whole peak of Kanchenjunga was fully illuminated, as if by a heavenly searchlight. The rock and ice were transfigured into a silver shrine, a visionary emblem of purity and aspiration. The worship of Kanchenjunga at that moment seemed very reasonable service." I think most of us who have seen Kanchenjunga would share Freshfield's sentiments. So finally, these are some of the books which are available on Kanchenjunga. Can we have the lights on, please? Out of all the books, I think if you want to read one, Kanchenjunga by Doug Scott would be the one I would recommend. It has the concise history of Kanchenjunga, and it's very well written. It was published by Scott posthumously after he passed away. And the other books are also there. Most of them are available on Amazon and elsewhere. And I think regarding this view, I don't think I have to say very much. I think most of the audience will recognize the Darjeeling view from the Mall Round with one of the old houses of Darjeeling. So thank you very much. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them. We have the lights, please. Any questions? Yeah. This is. Yeah.
Which is the actual peak, the top?
This one.
The middle one?
No, this one, the left one. This one, the first one on the left. The first one on the left. Any other questions?
Have you ever seen a snow leopard?
No. I've seen pug marks, but I have not seen a snow leopard. But there are expeditions now in Ladakh and Lahul and Spiti where they take you to actually see the snow leopard. I think in Sikkim it would be very difficult because the terrain is such, it would be very difficult to find a snow leopard in Sikkim. No, no. And that is the frustration of the trekkers. The terrain is hard, the food is terrible, the lodges are despicable, and you don't see any mountain. And you're struggling, but you see other mountains. Like you see Janu and you see all other peaks, but Kanchenjunga eludes you until you do that turn. If you don't do that turn, you won't see it anymore. Yes, Darjeeling is the south side. This is the south side. Yeah, this is the south side. You're behind it actually, on the other side. You see other peaks. Janu is there, quite spectacular. Kabur is there. There are other peaks on the way. No, they stopped. 3 meters short. No, now they are going from Nepal side, but 55, 77, and 79, all three expeditions stopped before the summit. But, I mean, you could see the summit. I mean, it was always taken as being a summit, even though they didn't go. Yeah, he had said that don't step on the summit. No, but now from the Nepal side, everybody's going to the summit. Sikkim has banned climbing on Kanchenjunga. There's no more climbing on Kanchenjunga. Sikkim has banned. No, Sikkim has banned Kanchenjunga and a whole lot of other peaks also, like Pandim Tandim and all. There's a whole series of peaks which Sikkim has put off the mountaineering map. But Nepal is open. Yeah. Yeah. Now is jeepable. But most people walk. Both are pretty good actually, both the views. Falut is a little bit closer, but Sandakphu actually also you get an expanse on the western side of Everest and Makalu and... Yeah, right. So that I think when you come to Falut, that sort of left side gets blocked by the view actually, but both are good.
And if you go that extra 3-hour walk to
Singalila. Yeah, you can carry on that way, and then from Singalila you continue and you reach that other trek, Poktedara, and then drop down into Sikkim. So you
from Singalila top you can get a good view.
Yeah, also. Yes, Shaya.
So when you travel, many of them refer to the 5 lords. So Kanchenjunga is sometimes called the mother, sometimes called is part of the 5 lords.
Yeah, the Lepchas called it that. Yeah.
Are there several different groups of people who Jiviraha or only the Lepchas?
No, actually, yeah, I would say there are different groups of people because in Sikkim itself, the Lepcha community is, you have what is known as the Bon faith. So, there are people who follow the Bon faith. So, the Bon faith is one group which also reveres Kanchenjunga. You find them in an area of Sikkim called Zongu, from Mangan. If you actually swing left into Zongu Valley, it's actually the home of the Bon faith, and they worship Kanchenjunga. So their worship of Kanchenjunga, I would imagine, is slightly different to the worship of the other people like the Pamyongsi Lamas and all. But ultimately, at the bottom line, they're all worshipping that same mountain, maybe in different ways.
The 5 lords is are they also sacred? Kabru and Kanchenjunga?
Yeah, they are. Any other questions? Yeah, please.
In this picture,
Yeah,
where is Pandim?
I'll show you. This is Pandim. This is Pandim. This is Narsing. This is Sinyolchu. This is Kanchenjunga. This is Kabru North and South. And this is Yan.
Pandim is to the east of Pandim.
Yes, always. It always comes on this side. When you look at Kanchenjunga, it's in the front, Pandim comes here.
But Sikkim is to the west.
Yes, when you're looking from Darjeeling, like we're looking from Darjeeling from the south looking north, Pandim will come to the east of Kanchenjunga. That's what is happening in this picture also. And also from Sandakphu is the same thing. It comes on the east. Any other questions?
Thanks to Sujoy, with whom I have been to many of his treks. My request to Sujoy is that whenever I went, he would carry a few more presentations with him. So after the trek, before dinner, he would present us with some of those wonderful short slideshows and some video clips. I would request if he still has them, whether he can show us some of them in maybe in the near future.
Certainly.
Some of them are really award-winning and brilliant videos of that mountain region. Anyway, thanks to Sujoy for this wonderful slideshow. Thanks to Telegraph for sponsoring this. Thanks to the staff of Bengal Flag and of course the Library Subcommittee. And I'm hoping that by end of this year we can invite him for another such wonderful slideshow. Thank you, Sujoy.
Thank you.
Just a token of thanks.